Hello, everyone, and welcome to the newest episode of Double Helix Blueprint of Nations. My name is Paul, and I want to introduce to you what we'll be talking about today. So, you know how we always talk about revolutions, like how they need guns and armies and all that? Well, what if I told you about this guy who figured out how to basically hack the whole system using something really simple, really common to you and I? Salt. Yeah, salt, the stuff on your kitchen table. See, in 1930, this 61-year-old lawyer named Gandhi, and I have a feeling like you may have heard of him, pulled off maybe the most brilliant piece of political theater in history. And I'm not talking about some symbolic protest that made people feel good but didn't actually change anything. I'm talking about a guy who figured out how to weaponize suffering itself. He literally turned getting beaten up into a superpower. And the crazy thing is that this wasn't just about getting the British Empire out of India. Gandhi basically invented a whole new way to fight that would spread everywhere. For instance, Montgomery, Alabama, that's Gandhi's legacy. Solidarity in Poland, also Gandhi's playbook. Tahrir Square, you guessed it, Gandhi as well. So today we're going to dig into these 24 days in March and April of 1930 when an old dude in a loincloth took a walk to the beach and somehow made the entire British Empire look like idiots. We're going to see how he turned picking up salt, something so basic that you died without it, into this devastating psychological weapon that the Brits just couldn't figure out how to handle. And this is why this fits perfectly into our show. This whole thing becomes part of India's DNA. Like even today, when India does diplomacy, when they position themselves as this moral force in international politics, when they talk about non-alignment and peaceful coexistence, all of that traces back to this 3 weeks when Gandhi proved you could beat an empire without firing a single shot. Oh, and before we jump in, quick thing. If you are digging these episodes and how we look at single moments that create this whole personality of a nation, please drop us a line at doublehelixhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Rate, like the podcast, leave us a review, and reviews honestly help us a lot. They are how other people find the show, and also tell someone about the show. It just takes 30 seconds, and that would be awesome, would help a lot. All right, let's do this. So, here's the setting. March 1930. The British think they're running India. And they're about to find out that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one shooting at you. It's the one who refuses to shoot back. In 2 minutes, an old man in a loincloth is going to pick up a handful of salt from this beach and shake the foundations of the British Empire. It is April 6 of 1930 in Dandi Beach, in Gujarat, at 6:28 a.m. He will shake those foundations not with violence, not with armies, but with salt. The British officials watching from the tree line know they should stop him. They have the authority. They have the guns. They're paralyzed because they've just realized something terrifying. They're not facing a criminal act. They're facing a moral reckoning that their entire system isn't equipped to handle. The man kneeling by the water's edge is Mohandas Gandhi. In his mind, he's not just collecting salt. He's collecting the fragments of Indian dignity that have been scattered across 3 centuries of colonial rule. And he's about to show the world that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bomb. It is the willingness to kneel in the sand and pick up what's already yours. This is our episode on India's moral revolution, 24 Days to Freedom. You know how they say you can't understand someone until you walk a mile in their shoes? Well, I'd argue you can't understand a nation until you've walked through its history. Not just the highlight reel or the sanitized version you find in textbooks, I mean really getting into its DNA. Those defining moments that shaped everything that came after. Those moments where paths were chosen, where decisions were made in palaces and backrooms and city streets that changed the course of millions of lives. I'm your host, Paul, and this is Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, where we unravel the genetic code of countries through their most transformative moments. Think of it like ancestry testing, but for entire nations. We dig deep into the historical DNA, finding those crucial moments that made countries who they are today. Before we talk about how an old man picking up salt could threaten an empire, we need to understand what that empire had built in India and what it had destroyed. The British didn't conquer India with armies alone. They conquered it with laws, with systems, with the slow, methodical replacement of Indian institutions with colonial machinery designed to extract wealth and to extract dignity. By 1930, the British Raj had perfected a system of control that was almost beautiful in its comprehensiveness. They controlled what Indians could produce, destroying the textile industry that had clothed half the world to create markets for Manchester mills. They controlled what Indians could learn, replacing Sanskrit and Persian with English in schools, creating a class of Indians who, in Macaulay's infamous words, would be Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. They control how Indians could govern themselves, or rather, couldn't. The Indian Civil Service, which administered a subcontinent of 300 million people, had exactly 1,000 positions. Of those, Indians could hold perhaps 100. The rest were reserved for British officers who arrived knowing nothing of India and left knowing only how to command it. But perhaps the most insidious control was over the smallest things, the everyday humiliations that reminded Indians constantly that they were the subjects, not the citizens, that they were children who needed British parents, that they were incapable of managing their own affairs. The Salt Act of 1882 was one of these small humiliations. It prohibited Indians from collecting or selling salt, a substance that literally washed up on their shores that their ancestors had gathered for 5,000 years. The British established a monopoly, forcing Indians to buy what nature provided freely, taxing a necessity of life that the poorest peasants needed to survive. It generated almost nothing for the imperial treasury, less than 3% of British India's revenue. But that wasn't the point. The point was control. The point was to demonstrate that British law reached into every Indian home, every Indian meal, every grain of rice that needed seasoning. This was the empire that Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi faced in 1930. A system so total, so seemingly permanent, that most Indians couldn't imagine its absence. The British had been in India for over 250 years. It survived the mutiny of 1857. They emerged from World War I stronger than ever. The sun, as they love to say, never set on the British Empire. But Gandhi had spent 2 decades studying this empire from within. 21 years in South Africa, learning how British law worked by practicing it, then breaking it. Another 15 years in India, testing the boundaries of colonial authority through local campaigns. Mill strikes in Ahmedabad, peasant protests in Champaran, tax resistance in Bardoli. He'd learned something crucial. The British Empire's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. It claimed moral authority. It justified its rule not through naked force but through a civilizing mission. It needed to believe, and needed the world to believe, that it ruled for India's benefit. This meant it was vulnerable to moral attack, not military attack. The British had proven at Amritsar in 1919 when General Dyer ordered his troops to fire on unarmed protesters until they ran out of ammunition, killing 379 people in 10 minutes, that they could and would use overwhelming force against violence. But what if the attack came not through violence, but through suffering? What if instead of giving the British an enemy to crush, you gave them a mirror to look into? We are in the Sabarmati ashram in Gujarat on March 2nd, 1930 at 4:30 a.m. The charkha spins in Gandhi's practiced hands, cotton transforming into thread with precision. This spinning wheel is itself a weapon of Gandhi's arsenal, a symbol of Indian self-sufficiency, a rejection of British textile imports, a daily meditation on independence that begins with individual action. The ashram around him is quiet. This community of several hundred followers lives by Gandhi's strict rules: vegetarianism, celibacy, prayer, manual labor, and above all, truth. Satyagraha, he calls it, truth force. The idea that truth itself, properly wielded, can overcome any oppression. For weeks, Gandhi has been searching for the perfect symbol to launch a new phase of resistance. The Indian National Congress, after decades of petitions and negotiations, has finally declared complete independence as its goal. The declarations are just words. Gandhi needs an action that will make independence real in Indian minds before it becomes real in political fact. He needs something that will unite Hindu and Muslim, Brahmin and untouchable, educated elite and illiterate peasant. Something so simple that everyone can participate. Something so obvious and unjust that defending it will destroy British credibility. Salt. As we said before, the 1882 Salt Act prohibits Indians from collecting or selling salt. The tax itself is minimal, the revenue negligible. But that's precisely why it's perfect. Gandhi isn't attacking British economic interest or military power. He's attacking something far more vulnerable, their claim to moral superiority. The letter Gandhi composes that morning to Lord Irwin, Viceroy of India, is a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as correspondence between gentlemen. Dear friend, it begins. Not Your Excellency, not Lord Viceroy, but friend. With two words, Gandhi reframes the entire colonial relationship as a disagreement between equals. He lists 11 demands, carefully calibrated from the impossible to the reasonable to the symbolic. Immediate independence sits alongside reduction in military expenditure and abolition of the salt tax. It's a negotiating position designed to be rejected because Gandhi doesn't want negotiation. He wants theater. If my letter makes no appeal to your heart, he writes, on the 11th day of this month, I shall proceed with such co-workers of the ashram as I can take to disregard the provisions of the salt laws. 9 days. He's given the British Empire 9 days to either capitulate to a man in homespun cloth or become the villain in a morality play that will be performed on the world stage. Lord Irwin's private secretary, reading the letter, reportedly laughed. So, the old man is going to walk to the sea and make salt? Let him. Who cares about salt? He would learn, as with the entire British establishment, that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the weight of empires. It is March 12th of 1930, at dawn. 78 marchers emerge from the ashram gates at 6:30 a.m. Each one has been personally selected by Gandhi, not for their political importance or social standing, but for their capacity to suffer without retaliation. They've trained for weeks. learning not just to withstand violence but to transform it through their response into something that indicts the perpetrator more than the victim. The international press is already assembled. Gandhi has made certain of that. Photographers from Life magazine, correspondents from the Times of London, reporters from Paris, Berlin, and New York. This march will not happen in isolation. Every step will be witnessed, documented, transmitted across oceans and continents. The route itself is political cartography. It is not the shortest path to the sea, 240 miles through Gujarat's villages, but the most symbolically resonant, through territories that witnessed the 1857 rebellion, past sites of ancient Indian kingdoms, through communities wavering in their support for independence. Each stop is calculated to build momentum, to transform a march into a movement. In the village of Aslali, just 4 miles from the ashram, the entire population waits. They've erected a platform decorated with flowers and homespun cloth. The headman, a Muslim named Hussein, offers Gandhi his life savings, 12 rupees, for the cause. Gandhi refuses the money but accepts a pinch of dust from the man's fields, declaring it more valuable than the British Empire's gold because it comes from free Indian soil. This becomes the pattern. At each village, local leaders pledge support. Women throw flower petals from the rooftops. Children run alongside the marchers. And Gandhi speaks, not of revolution or violence, but of spinning wheels and village industries, of dignity through self-sufficiency, of freedom that begins in the minds before it reaches the battlefield. By the fourth day, the arithmetic of resistance has become undeniable. Day 1 brings 78 marchers. Day 4 brings 1,000. Day 8, 5,000. Day 12, 10,000. But the numbers tell only part of the story. What's happening along the route is cellular multiplication of resistance. In every village the march passes, committees form, salt rates are planned, British goods are boycotted. The Raj's carefully constructed apparatus of control, built on cooperation as much as coercion, begins to dissolve. The British watch, paralyzed by their own contradictions. The Secretary of State for India cables from London. Can we not arrest him for sedition? The governor of Bombay responds. On what grounds? He's walking. Since when is walking sedition? But he intends to break the law. Intend is not the same as commits. We cannot arrest a man for future crimes without looking like the despotism he claims we are. This is Gandhi's genius. He's created Suksvan, that chess position where every possible move worsens your situation. Arrest him before he breaks the law, and you validate his claim that British rule is tyrannical. Let him proceed, and he builds unstoppable momentum. Attack the march with force, and you create martyrs. The empire that conquers through superior strategy finds itself strategically impotent. It is day 9 of the march, at dusk, on the village of Broch, on March 21st, 1930. Something unexpected happens as Gandhi addresses the evening assembly. A British police superintendent named Patel, an Indian in colonial service, approaches the platform. The crowd of 3,000 tenses, hands instinctively clench. This could be the confrontation everyone has been expecting, dreading, anticipating. The superintendent requests permission to speak with Gandhi privately. What happens next is pure psychological mastery. Gandhi instead invites him onto the platform, in a full view of the crowd. He offers him water, introduces him as our friend who has come to visit, and asks if he would like to address the assembly. Superintendent, completely wrong-footed, stammers something about maintaining order and retreats. Gandhi turns to the crowd. You see how nervous he was? This is the nervousness of injustice confronting truth. We must not hate him for being trapped in an immoral system. We must pity him, and through our suffering, show him the way to liberation. This is the secret weapon of Satyagraha. It doesn't dehumanize the opponent. It offers them redemption through recognition of shared humanity. It makes it harder for them to dehumanize you in return. The superintendent leaves, but 50 Indian policemen resign their positions that night rather than potentially enforce violence against the marchers. Winston Churchill, reading the intelligence reports in London, explodes. The nauseating and humiliating spectacle of this one-time inner-temple lawyer, now turned seditious fakir, striding half-naked up the steps of the Viceroy's palace to negotiate on equal terms with the representative of the King Emperor. But Churchill misses the point. Gandhi isn't trying to negotiate. He's already won the psychological battle by making negotiations seem necessary. By day 15, the Salt March has achieved what 3 decades of Indian National Congress resolutions could not. It's made Indian independence an international cause of celebration. Editorial pages from New York to Paris debate the morality of colonialism. The Manchester Guardian writes, "The spectacle of an empire threatened by a pinch of salt would be comic if it were not so tragic for what it reveals about the foundations of our rule." American churches hold prayer meetings for the marchers. Socialist parties in Europe pass resolutions of support. Even the Soviet press, typically hostile to Gandhi's rejection of class warfare, acknowledges the tactical brilliance of this approach. The images are perfect for the age of mass media. A frail ascetic in simple clothes walking peacefully while the might of the British Empire watches helplessly. David versus Goliath. Except David isn't even fighting. He's simply walking towards his destiny. Dandi Beach, April 5th, 1930. Day 24. Sunset. They arrive at the Arabian Sea as the sun bleeds orange across the water. The crowd now numbers over 50,000. Gandhi kneels in prayer on the beach, but doesn't touch the salt. Not yet. One more night of legal obedience before the universe shifts. That night, no one sleeps. British reinforcements arrive. Hundreds of police trucked in from Bombay. They set up positions around the beach, rifles loaded with live ammunition. Orders are deliberately vague. Maintain order, prevent breach of peace. No one wants to give the command that might echo throughout history. Gandhi spends the night writing. He writes letters to activists across India. Be ready. Articles for international newspapers. Bear witness. Instructions to his ashram. If I am arrested, do not mourn. Celebrate, for imprisonment is freedom's price. At 5:30 a.m., he rises and bathes in the sea. Returns to the camp. Leads morning prayers. Then, at 6:30 a.m. precisely, walks to the water's edge. On April 6, 1930, at 6:30 a.m., the moment. Gandhi kneels in the sand where the tide has retreated. His fingers sift through the deposits left by evaporating seawater. They close around a small lump of crystallized salt. He stands, holds it high, declares in a voice that carries across the beach, across the nation, across the century. With this salt, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire. The crowd erupts, not in violence but in replication. Thousands rush to the water's edge, scooping up salt, holding it aloft like communion wafers. Within hours, the entire coastline of India becomes a site of sacred criminality. Millions gather salt. The jails cannot hold them all. The empire cannot arrest the entire subcontinent. But this is just the beginning. We are now at the Dharasana salt works on May 21st, 1930. Gandhi is arrested on May 4th, but he's designed the movement to be a hydra. Cut off one head, two more appear. Leadership passes to Abbas Tiabi, a 76-year-old retired judge. When he's arrested, it passes to Sarojini Naidu, a poet commanding an assault on imperial infrastructure. The Dharasana Salt Works is a massive British-controlled facility. On May 21st, 2,500 volunteers march towards it. Webb Miller of the United Press is there to witness what happens next. In complete silence, the Gandhi volunteers drew up in lines of 25, each holding his hands to his sides. The police rushed forward and rained blows on their heads with steel-shod lathis. Not one of the marchers even raised an arm to fend off the blows. They went down like ninepins. From where I stood, I heard the sickening whacks of the clubs on unprotected skulls. Group after group approaches. Group after group is beaten down. For hours, the volunteers do not strike back. They do not retreat. They simply keep coming, wave after wave, absorbing violence until the police themselves begin to break. Some throwing down their lathis, some whipping as they strike. Miller's report travels around the world. In 18 years of reporting in 22 countries, I have never witnessed such harrowing scenes as at Dharasana. Whatever moral ascendancy the West once held, it is lost today. India is free. She may not have political independence yet, but the chains that bind her are of her own choosing now. 2 dead, 320 hospitalized, 0 retaliation. The mathematics of moral victory are complete. What Gandhi achieved in these 24 days isn't just a protest or even a movement. It's the invention of a new form of warfare, moral insurgency. He's discovered that in the age of mass media and democratic values, a government's legitimacy depends not just on the force that it uses, but on the narrative. Control the narrative, and you control the conflict. Think about the components of this new warfare. First, you need a symbolic target, an injustice so clear, so universally understood, that defending it undermines the defender's credibility. Salt is perfect. Everyone needs it. Everyone understands it, and prohibiting people from gathering it from their own shores is colonialism reduced to absurdity. Then there's what I call the suffering gradient. You structure resistance so that any escalation of force by authorities creates worse optics for them. A beating given is more damaging than a beating received if the world is watching. The participation architecture matters too. You create levels of involvement that allow everyone to participate according to their capacity. Not everyone can march to Dandi, but everyone can make salt. Not everyone can face police lathis, but everyone can boycott British cloth. Gandhi forces the British to look in what becomes a moral mirror. He makes them confront their gap between their stated values, civilizing mission, rule of law, Christian charity, and their actions, beating peaceful protesters, imprisoning poets, taxing salt. And crucially, he ensures international witnesses. He transforms a local conflict into a global morality play, making it impossible for democratic nations to support the oppressor without undermining their own legitimacy. The British did try every countermeasure. Censorship fails because the international press is already embedded. Mass arrests backfire because the jails overflow and each arrest creates more supporters. Violence only validates Gandhi's narrative. Negotiation legitimizes the movement. Ignoring it proves impossible because it's too large, too visible, too infectious. They're trapped in Gandhi's web, and every struggle to escape tightens the thread. Watch how this technology travels throughout history. Montgomery, 1955. Rosa Parks refuses to yield her bus seat. Martin Luther King Jr., who has studied Gandhi obsessively, leads a boycott that follows the Salt March blueprint precisely. Choose something symbolic, make suffering visible, maintain absolute discipline, win through moral authority. Gdansk, 1980. Lech Walesa leads Polish shipyard workers in strikes that paralyzed the communist regime. The image of workers kneeling in prayer while facing riot police becomes Poland's Dharasana. Beijing, 1989. A lone man stands in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square. The power of that image comes not from violence, but from its absence, the choice to resist through presence alone. Here's one crucial caveat, though. It doesn't always work. Gandhi's method requires specific conditions. An opponent constrained by some moral framework or public opinion. Media attention that makes suffering visible. Disciplined followers capable of absorbing violence without retaliation. Clear demands that expose systemic injustice. When these conditions don't exist, you end up with something else entirely. For instance, Syria's civil war, Myanmar's ethnic cleansing, Xinjiang's camps. Peaceful resistance often fails catastrophically. Gandhi himself acknowledged this, saying his methods worked against the British precisely because, despite their imperialism, they remained susceptible to moral pressure. The Salt March's success also conceals its tremendous human cost. The volunteers are Dharasana. Many never recover from skull fractures and organ damage. The psychological trauma of choosing to walk into violence repeatedly. Gandhi himself, his health destroyed by repeated fasts, aged far beyond his years. His family paid too. Kastruba, his wife, imprisoned repeatedly, her health shattered. His sons, growing up in the shadows of sainthood, struggling to find identity. Harilal, the eldest, became an alcoholic who converted to Islam partly to wound his father. The personal became political, and the political consumed the personal. Gandhi wrestled with these moral implications. Is it ethical to ask people to suffer for political change? Is peaceful resistance truly more moral if it results in greater suffering for your own side? Does privileging nonviolence sometimes mean accepting prolonged injustice that violence resistance might end quickly? His answer, as always, was nuanced. Violence, he argued, creates cycles of revenge that poison societies for generations. Independence won through violence carries violence in its DNA. The means determine the ends. But he also said violence was preferable to cowardice. If people couldn't find courage for active nonviolent resistance, violent resistance was better than passive acceptance. Modern India carries the Salt March in its civilizational DNA, shaping its self-perception and international behavior in profound ways. The positive inheritance is clear. India's emergence as a soft power, superpower, its moral authority in international forums, its ability to mediate conflicts because it's seen as principle rather than purely self-interest. But there is a shadow side. Sometimes, India's attachment to moral positioning prevents pragmatic solutions. The Kashmir conflict, border disputes with China, relationships with neighbors. This might benefit the realpolitik rather than the rhetoric. The nation's self-image as uniquely peaceful can blind it to its own capacity for violence, as seen in communal riots, military actions, and international repression. The Salt March ended on April 6, 1930. But in a deeper sense, it never ended. Every time someone chooses peaceful resistance over violent retaliation, every time suffering is transformed into moral power, every time injustice is exposed through disciplined protest, the march continues. 24 days that didn't immediately win independence. That would take 17 more years. But 24 days that proved empires could fall without armies, that moral authority could defeat military might, that the structures we think permanent are actually fragile constructions maintained only by our participation. Gandhi was assassinated on January 30th, 1948, less than 6 months after the independence he fought for. His killer was a Hindu nationalist who thought Gandhi too sympathetic to Muslims, too willing to see Pakistan as a brother rather than an enemy. The prophet of nonviolence died by violence, but his last words were Ram, Ram, a prayer. Even in death, no hatred, no call for revenge, just acceptance. Perhaps that's the Salt March's deepest lesson, that choosing nonviolence isn't about being passive or weak, it's about being so strong in your convictions that not even death can make you betray them. It's about understanding that violence might win battles, but only love wins wars. That hatred might destroy enemies, but only compassion builds nations. The British Empire that seemed eternal in 1930 was gone by 1947, exhausted by its own contradictions, delegitimized by its response to moral challenge. But the ideas Gandhi embedded in those 24 days, they're still here, still spreading, still teaching each new generation that sometimes the greatest power is the power to kneel in the sand and pick up what was always yours. Next time on Double Helix, we're heading to Switzerland in 1515, where a devastating military defeat transforms Europe's most feared mercenaries into the most determined neutrals. We'll see how the Swiss turned military catastrophe into diplomatic triumph, how geographic vulnerability became strategic advantage, and how a small nation surrounded by great powers discovered that sometimes the strongest position is refusing to take one. Until then, thank you for listening. We will see you soon.